Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Duke, and welcome to our fourth and final installment of our lecture series on the historical and cultural consequences of abortion. Today, I am joined by one of the most prominent and uncompromising Christian voices in all of Western culture, Steve Deace, the host of the Steve Deace Show on CRTV, and to the many, many, many Christians in our audience, instead of buying Jesse Duplantis a $54 million private jet, consider instead subscribing to CRTV and Steve's show. You'll get way more spiritual bang for your buck. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
That is the most unique pitch for our show I have heard yet, but it's got a good beat and you can dance to it, Duke. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hey, and if you get $54 million, I only want 10%.
And you know, this is only going to cost you $0.25 a day is what it costs to go to CRTV. A lot less than Jesse's latest jet airplane. Yes. Exactly
right. Well, Steve, you have had, a tremendous life story with regards to abortion that you touched your family very closely. If you don't mind, share a little bit with the audience your experiences and that remarkable situation that your own wife endured.
Well, my story really begins Christmas break, 1972, with a high school freshman who just took a pregnancy test. And learned that she was pregnant by her high school senior boyfriend and is scared, doesn't really know what to do. Some of her friends had those so-called back alley abortions. And, like a lot of when we're that age, she kind of just put it off and figured, I'm just not going to deal with this right now. And maybe something will come up and some kind of answer. And I'm not really sure what to do, how to tell my mom. And I'm just going to do the equivalent of, my parents tell me to clean my room. I just hide everything under the bed, close the door, and hope they don't go in. And a few weeks later, she sees a newspaper headline about this Supreme Court opinion in January of 1973 called Roe versus Wade. And she's just had her 15th birthday. And she thinks maybe I can get one of those safe, legal, and so-called rare abortions, because I'm not ready yet to be a mom. She's really struggling with her boyfriend's family. He wants to actually do right by her. His family's very well-to-do and very prominent here in Des Moines. His dad is a judge here in town. His uncle's on the city council. But his older brother, just a couple of years prior, had gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and she had married into the family. And his dad vowed he wasn't going to let any more quote unquote white trash get pregnant and marry into his family. So he wasn't going to put up with it. And in fact, he calls in this young lady's mother, who is also a single mom, twice divorced in the early 1970s with 5 kids from 2 previous husbands, which is a tough life in 2018, let alone in 1973, calls her into his chambers and has her sign a piece of paper in exchange for $500 about the cost of an abortion and aftercare, and has her sign a piece of paper saying that his son is not the father of her daughter's baby. Now, of course, that would never hold up in a court of law, but when you're a poor single mother in 1973 and a judge has you one-on-one in his chambers, and he's offering you money, you take it. In the end, she can't have the abortion. She decides she just can't go through with it morally, and decides to have her baby. And on July 28, 1973, at Iowa Lutheran Hospital, this 15-year-old girl named Vicky gives birth to a baby boy at 11:59 a.m. and names her child Stephen. And that child is me. This is my life story. And not too long before this, a couple decades before this, there's a 15-year-old girl in rural Michigan that is also pregnant under some difficult circumstances and some tragic circumstances. And her family takes her to a back alley abortionist a couple of different times to have the baby gotten rid of. And for various reasons, he's unable to complete the procedure. The last time they took her there, I think, was the 3rd attempt. And he refused to do it because the baby was so far along, he just wasn't going to morally justify it. So they do what a lot of families in those days did in these situations. They sent the girl away to spend some time with family in another state, have the baby, and then return home. They give the baby away to a relatively new adoption agency in Michigan at the time that probably some of your viewers have heard of by now. It's fairly well known these days. It's called Bethany Christian Services. And they gave this baby girl away. And there's a couple in West Michigan. He's a doctor and a successful one and a veteran. And he and his wife have been unable to conceive on their own. And they're looking at adopting. And they think this baby girl is just gorgeous, so they decide to adopt her. And then, of course, how many times have you heard this story? After they adopt her, then they end up getting pregnant the old-fashioned way 5 times. So they have 5 more children after this. But they end up adopting this baby girl. They name her Mary. The years go by. She meets a young man in the 101st Airborne named Bobby Ramsey. They get married. He gets stationed out in Nuremberg, West Germany in 1975. And they have one child while he is stationed out there. And it's a daughter. And they name her Amy. And that's my wife. That's my wife's birth story. So it would be extraordinary enough to have both of us come from sort of what is the conventional wisdom about why we need child killing, why we need to exterminate children, why we need this progressive civil right of child sacrifice, why we need it. But it doesn't even end there for our family. In the last 2 pregnancies my wife and I had, with our youngest daughter, Zoe, I can't ever remember, Duke, the perfect medical terminology, whether it's 1 vessel cord or 2 vessel cords, but she was 1 vessel cord short with Zoe. And they warned us that they discovered it too late, and it could very well mean birth defects. Maybe we would want to consider abortion. Of course, we didn't even put that on the table, even when they suggested it. But what it did mean is that, she was very troubled in utero. Amy had to go in originally for the 3rd trimester. It was originally 1 day a week. She had to go in for weekly checkups to make sure the baby's heartbeat was there, for ultrasounds. And then as we got closer to delivery, it was 2 and sometimes 3 days a week. And then when we couldn't detect Zoe's heartbeat for more than a day, they had to, over the 4th of July weekend, induce an emergency labor. And when they couldn't get Amy to go into labor, they were going to send her home. Let's just say I forcefully rejected that option at the hospital, that we weren't going home. They were not going to bring my wife to this point and then send us home. Not if she's in distress and then they say the baby's in distress. So they worked harder again to induce labor. Finally, they were able to. And I remember the doctor's first words when he delivered Zoe is he said under his breath, "I'm surprised she's alive." And, Zoe will turn 13 in July. She's a beautiful girl. She does have some learning disabilities. You wouldn't know it if you talked to her. Like a lot of high-functioning dyslexics, I know there's this stereotype that you see the letters backwards, and this as an educator, Duke, a lot of those stereotypes about dyslexia and stuff are actually not true. She actually reads at an exceedingly high level, complex problem solving. She's actually better at it than I am. On the other hand, very simple functions, some simple mathematics, shoe tying and things of that nature are very difficult for her. But if you talk to her for more than 10 minutes, other than the fact she's your typical high maintenance preteen girl, you would have no clue at all that they were recommending to us that we abort her before she was born. And then our final child, which we did not intend to be our final child, but when our very, very pro-life Catholic OBGYN at the time recommended that it be, because he didn't think Amy could sustain another pregnancy after this one just about killed her. We took his advice, but that was Noah. And what happened with Noah is in the final throes of Amy's pregnancy, as we entered into the third trimester, we were down to the last couple of weeks, and they recognized that his measurements and everything were way off, and he was way undernourished and way underdeveloped. And I was actually teaching at our church at the time, and our oldest daughter, Anna, called me and said, "Daddy, you got to go home right now. Something's wrong with Mommy." And my wife had basically slipped into a coma. And her blood pressure had soared to numbers that I can't really even add in my head. They were both numbers were well into the top number was in the 200s, the high 200s, and the other number was well into the 100s. I just know enough to know that's not good. So we had to rush her to the ER right away. And they had to do an emergency C-section. They told me ahead of time that there was a decent chance that one or both of them would not make it. And this was a very high-risk pregnancy. But this goes to the whole, well, we need to have abortion safe and available in the case of the mother's life is in danger. And morally, I understand. I'm not even comfortable myself arguing to a family in a situation like that when they feel as if they have to choose a life, what they should do. But it really doesn't, when you think about it medically, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you have to deliver the child to save the mom, why kill the kid? That whole argument doesn't make any sense when you actually lay it out. And I've lived through that argument with my wife and with my son. And when they brought Noah out, he literally fit in the palm of my hand. And he had to spend several weeks at the NICU before they would send him home with us. And he's probably always going to be a little bit on the shorter side. But, now here he sits at 12. He's going to be 12 in February. And he's your typical little dude, man. He'll stay on the computer and play Robux all day if we let him. He wants to shoot baskets with his friends. He's huge into football. I think I've learned every form of acceptable Jedi lightsaber fighting techniques from him in the last couple of weeks. And now mom is okay as well. Now, when you've had two crisis pregnancies like that back to back, Amy's had a lot of follow-up health issues that we've kind of kept to ourselves. And, when I do a public job, and so I'm pretty transparent, but we need some privacy. So I don't want to make it look like, everything's been wine and roses. There's been follow-up operations and things of that nature. But I'm 100% confident if Amy were here and she's homeschooled our kids, and now with Noah, we have him enrolled at FreedomProject Academy because we felt like maybe he needed a little extra challenge than we could provide for him at home. But I don't think Amy would tell you that she would change anything whatsoever. And it's not been easy. These are hard situations for families. We lived through them. We are both byproducts of these hard situations for families. But I think there's no way you can convince me, having been on both ends of this now, Duke, having been the child that was on the chopping block, and then having been the parent who was consulted to put his child on the chopping block. Having lived through both sides of this, if you went back and asked my mom now, 45 years later, she would tell you I'm a pain in her butt. I'm the best pain in her butt, best mistake she ever made. I don't see how killing your child and adding the extra grief and regret and remorse that goes along with that makes these difficult situations any better. In fact, my wife can tell you, because one of the things she does now is counseling. And a lot of it is people dealing with sexual dysfunction and things of that nature. And she can tell you firsthand, it never makes the situation better in the end. It always makes it worse.
It's a very moving story, Steve, and I've heard versions of it before. And I love the frankness with which you speak. Chopping block. One of the reasons I think we're in this mess is because we have used linguistics to really conceal, hide, mask, lie about what we are doing when we enter into such a procedure. And I really do believe that the vast majority of men and women, if they understood the physical logistics of what it takes, the toll it takes on an even healthy mother, and the psychological and sociological and conscience-driven lingering effects that happen with even the most profoundly feminist women, we would think it differently. I believe that. And words like chopping block, I think, are not hyperbole. They are exactly what we're dealing with here. It's a very moving story. And when you think about where you are today, you mentioned your mother, she's still alive. And I to confirm, your mother has never one moment of 1 second of her life regretted her decision to give birth to you.
No. Although I'm sure there were times when I was 14 or 15 or 16 years old, she might have reconsidered whether to give me up for adoption. But that's probably a topic for another day.
Well, and that's it, and I know lots and lots of moms. In fact, the overwhelming majority of mothers who have kept babies with when there were medical or other issues that had them thinking abortion, there's almost, I can't, in the thousands that I've talked to in my tour across the country, not once have I heard a single regret from any of those mothers. Right. What I have heard is, and I'm sure you have too, is a lot of regret from mothers after the fact who were talked into abortions.
And I think it's because it's a decision that can't be undone, Duke. And that leaves you with unresolved regret. That leaves you with unmet expectations. Several years ago, we're big movie buffs, and my wife and I were sitting in the theater, and now they figured out how to get you with the commercials. With DVRs, you can just totally live a commercial-free life if you want now, right? So they figured out how to pin you down. Now they load up the movies with them. So there's like 30 minutes of commercials before every movie these days. And one of the commercials was from a liberal education advocacy group, and they were talking about their concern with the high dropout rate in America's public high schools. And the ad began with this full hallway of kids at this high school, this public high school. And then they started inserting the dropout rate, and kids start disappearing. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, you could do this exact same ad when you start talking about infanticide, when you start talking about child killing, abortion. Because here's the thing. There's a human cost, a human toll to every one of those deaths. We don't, and one of the things this ad meant, this liberal education advocacy ad mentioned is, how do you know that one of these kids who dropped out wouldn't have discovered a clean, renewable energy source? How do you know one of them wouldn't have discovered a cure for cancer or even the common cold? The same thing. All of these things apply to the issue of abortion, and let's make it even more personal. Anybody watching us right now that has had a relationship they thought was going to fulfill them, was going to be the life partner that they had longed for, and it's either not materialized, or it ended in heartbreaking divorce or a breakup or disappointing fashion, and now you're wondering, am I just going to be single? Am I destined to be lonely, to not have a family? We don't know that any one of those 60 million people that we've killed, and that's according to Guttmacher, which is a pro-child killing think tank. I like to always just use their numbers. The 60 million people we've killed, we don't know that one of them wouldn't have been that life partner, wouldn't have been that person that you would have had a family with, that would have made a huge difference in impacting your life, wouldn't have been the ideal father for you as a woman to raise your children with, or the ideal mother for you as a man to raise your children and have children with. See, we don't really look at it that way, because I don't even like to use the term abortion. I think you've been able to tell in this interview I've tried to come up with different words, because it sounds like I'm getting my tonsils out. It sounds like, well, I've got this unviable tissue mass that's kind of in the way of me self-actualizing. So let me just stop in for about 15 minutes here at the local Planned Parenthood, get rid of that sucker, and just move on with the rest of my life. It sounds anesthetized. It sounds clinical. It sounds like an antibacterial wipe, and that's on purpose. It's to do that, to not alert us to really what is the moral calculation here. What is really the human toll that we have lost as a society here? And it has transcendent tentacles. For example, we're told right now, and it's a scam, and I've proven these numbers on my show many times, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to grant this notion that we have to have open borders and mass amnesty because there's not enough American workers. Well, maybe one of the reasons why there's not enough American workers, Duke, is we killed 60 million of them. You look at our national debt, for example. Maybe if we had another 60 million adults working in the private sector, paying taxes into the system, we wouldn't be as burdened by soul-crushing debt as a people as we are. One of my radio mentors used to say, God's natural law is often self-enforcing. And when we break God's law, it will usually break us. But we have chosen to break God's law in this area, and it is breaking us in all kinds of other areas that are consequences that were largely unforeseen when we made this choice in the moment that can't be reversed later on.
You know, when I teach my university classes or I get into discussions with progressives, when it comes to the gun control issue, I think there's some parallels. I point out to them all the time, why are you progressives? If you actually believe that Donald Trump is a Nazi and the American government is being taken over by Nazis.
Why do you want him to have all the guns?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Why in the world would you not want every liberal armed to the teeth? And it's the same thing here. We talked about this in the first week segment of this show. If what you liberals really care about, progressives really care about, is the weakest, the minority, that which has no voice, particularly ethnic minority babies, young little girls with no voice for them, how do you justify this kind of murder that takes such a toll, particularly in black communities? Was it 2 or 3 years ago, that in New York City, Manhattan, there were more black babies aborted than were born in the entire year there? So I want to ask you, and I think this could be a good segue for us to talk briefly about the central role Planned Parenthood has assumed in fostering these misunderstandings about what abortion is. But talk a little bit, Steve, about, as a culture, what has happened to us, particularly the progressives among us, that are utterly incapable of seeing even if you want to call it the illogic, the hypocrisy of what they claim to be and who they claim to support, and how they can justify a mother taking the life of her baby, which 99.9% of the time is about comfort. It's not about necessity.
This is a complicated question, Duke, that I think has multiple answers. I don't think we can paint by numbers or one size fits all here. Some of it is the notion of progressive ideology. The father of progressivism, really the motto of progressivism, is, did God really say? It really starts from there. It begins with the notion human nature is basically good, and therefore we can progress to create our own utopia on earth. We can it's the character Tom Hanks plays in the movie The Circle, where he says, I believe in the perfectibility of man. So right away, you are at odds with the created order, which is human nature is not basically good. And there is a God, and we are all accountable to him. And without his help, we can't even be good, let alone perfect. So right from the outset, progressive ideology simply is not just, it's at odds with the basic working of the cosmos, of the creation. Other than that, though, I'm saying there's a chance. And so there, you have one group of people who are just what we used to call humanists. They are just invested in this as an ideology. This is their hermeneutic, and it must be true. And they are every bit as dogmatic about it as the fundamentalist Christians they like to mock. And they will believe anything that allows them to continue to hold on to those tenets, because, like the crowd outside of Lot's house, they simply refuse to accept accountability and grace from God, even if it draws them into heinous hedonism and intellectual thought that with frankly just a little rudimentary pushback could be completely and totally deconstructed, and they know that, and that's why they created political correctness, so they wouldn't have to risk losing arguments by never having them. Just call everybody who disagrees with us racist, misogynistic, homophobic, xenophobic bigots, and we don't have to risk losing arguments because we're so above you, you're not worthy of us having them with you. That's one group of people. And then there is what I like to call the cult of progressivism and the groupthink that it creates. See, I think progressivism is the heresy of this age. I think it's and I say this on my show, and I've written this many times, it is the Marcion, it's the Arius, it's the Pelagius. It's the heresy of this age. We view it incorrectly as a political ideology, and that's why many of our churches are succumbing to it, because they don't want to take, particularly at this point in time when half the days you can't tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats anymore, and so they really don't want to get into partisan politics. They don't want to look like a clown like Jerry Falwell Jr. or on the right, or Jim Wallace, who's a communist, on the left. And so a lot of our Orthodox churches are just simply saying the only way to win the game is not to play, and we're just not going to get involved. Well, they don't understand the enemy of progressivism. They think that it's a political ideology. It's much more than that. It's an ecclesiology where the state replaces the church. It's a theology where the government, as Chesterton said, once the government removes the God, the government becomes the God. It has its own moral ethic. It has its own hermeneutic. It has its own logic system of postmodernism. It is every bit a theology, a theological framework that is right now competing for the hearts and minds of the West. And most of our churches refuse or are ignorant of recognizing it as such. And they end up, by doing that, Duke, they actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy because they will not confront progressivism on the moral and theological level. It's therefore left to be only fought on the political level, and they end up creating the very hyper-myopically partisan, tribalistic atmosphere they claim they want to abscond from because they will not transcendently fulfill their calling as a church, and nature abhors a vacuum, and so we'll get cheap imitations from political parties trying to do the job very imperfectly and very badly that the church is put on earth to do. And that leads to the second aspect of this. We've done several shows recently on Bono and U2 supporting abortion in their native Ireland. And I've watched interviews Bono has given on Focus on the Family talking about not Jesus as Che Guevara, Jesus as our Savior, a personal relationship with God in the flesh. I mean, this is arguably the most successful pop musician of his time since the Beatles. You can make the argument that U2 is the most successful pop music act since the Beatles or the Stones or a group of that from yesteryear. And here he is arguing Trinitarian orthodoxy. And capitalism is good and it's best for people. It does better to fight poverty than socialism does. And yet here they are urging Ireland to lift its amendment, making it one of the last remaining pro-life nations in the West. And here's a guy who's been a voice for countless voiceless around the world, countless dissidents around the world, and yet he lends his voice to killing the voiceless countrymen in the womb from his native Ireland. Now, how does this happen? You know, for me, I did not go to church as a kid. I grew up as a pagan kid. And a lot of the scripture that I was first taught came from Pride in the Name of Love, and I still haven't found what I'm looking for, and Where the Streets Have No Name, listening to U2 songs as a high school kid. And so I remember those days, and now that I'm a Christian and I'm trying to reconcile these two things, and I think what it comes down to is the identity politic, the pull of progressivism is the way that it uses groupthink to enforce the masses. And this is why when you have a situation, people wonder, you know, Steve, how come the left is not debating each other over Samantha Bee the way the right was debating each other over Roseanne Barr this week? And and it goes right to this situation with Bono and abortion. Here's why. It's very hard when you are a cult. When you're a cult, groupthink is the governing policy. There is no room for individual conscience. And to exert your individual conscience, you are shunned. You're outside the group. And so what happens is black ministers who they will preach fire and brimstone that a lot of their wimpy, spineless suburban megachurch counterparts would never dare say in a pulpit because it might turn off their 4 biggest donors. You go to a lot of inner city black churches and you'll hear it's like John Wesley came back to life. We're doing sinners in the hand of an angry God. And then they're like, and 30 more minutes and then I'm done. And they sit there for hours and you're like, and then when they're done, they go out and vote for Barack Obama. Why? How? I don't understand this. It doesn't resonate. How does Bono do interviews in the Rolling Stone magazine about how Jesus is God and then turns around and says, repeal the 8th and kill babies? And you're trying to figure out, if you're not part of this identity politic, how do you reconcile these things? It's the groupthink. It's the idea that I must conform holistically to this model. Because if I claim one area of conscience, if I claim one area, if I'm the black minister who says, I agree with you, the government should supply health care, I agree with affirmative action, I think the government should do jobs programs for poor communities like mine, but I'm not going to stand for having another Planned Parenthood placed here on Martin Luther King Boulevard, you're gone. I saw this in my own home state. good buddy of mine, Keith Ratliff, was the longtime head of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP, never supported a Republican in his life. And he supported a good buddy of mine, Bob Vanderplas, last time he ran for governor, because he was willing to defend the marriage issue. And boy, when he crossed that picket line, Duke, when he crossed that picket line, this is a guy that had done decades of civil rights work here in the Midwest. They kicked him out. They evicted him. You're not permitted your own conscience. A couple of years ago, after the original gay marriage ruling from the court, Andrew Sullivan, who's one of the original gay rights activists in America, wrote an article on his blog talking about how, hey, now that we have our equality, we don't want to be like those Christians where we're putting down the rights of people who don't agree with us. We don't want to create this sort of Gestapo police state. He was destroyed on the comment section of his own blog by people who took this guy who was fighting for gay rights before most people knew what they were, and now suddenly he's an Uncle Tom because he dared to think for himself. And this is the lure of the progressive cult. See, within the conservative movement, there's such a high emphasis on individuality that this makes it hard for us to come together as a movement because everybody's got their own little individual areas where they have a higher priority than everybody else. It's like herding cats. On the other side, they have the exact opposite problem, which is because conformity is the number one goal. You aren't allowed any area of conscience whatsoever. And this is where you won't see people, even though they know this is wrong. If I say something about this, if I oppose this, and the way U2 backed it was very passive aggressively. They put out one tweet. It wasn't like a statement or a song or a press conference. It was like they were literally tithing to the church of state. Fine, here's my alm. Take my check. Now leave me the hell alone, right? That is the conformity of the cult of progressivism in action.
Yeah, I think that's really incisive, Steve. Very, very important. I would add one thing to it from my own perspective and experience. Why are groups like you two, who do seem to have such a social conscience? I think it's the world. Christ warned us that one of the big dangers, enough people realize still that you run away from the devil, right? And enough people still realize that the flesh is the source of some of our worst desires. But I really think that most people on the progressive left, and alarmingly many of our own religious institutions in Christianity, have come to ignore the fact that the world's a problem too. Bono is a tremendous advocate for those who are born in suffering, but that sympathy does not seem to apply to the preborn, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's because Christians have become terribly worldly. The prosperity gospel is being preached in across the world much more often than the gospel of sin and salvation is. And when you think about that this materialist perspective, progressivism is purely materialism, isn't it? All of its origins, all of its arguments stem from this hermetic box of materialism. The nature as we have it, nothing transcends it, nothing goes before it. So you and I, we read verses, and tears come to our eyes. We read verses like, before you were knit together in your mother's womb, I knew you. And even supposedly devout Christians like Bono can make no sense of that. When a child's on this side and hungry and crying, we'll move mountains to feed it. And thank God that we do. And thank God that progressives want to do that. Mm-hmm. But up until that moment, the before and the after, even again, really strong Christian voices in our culture have completely chose to ignore it. And the consequences of this are enduring. I want to, in the time that we have left, we've been doing this for 3 weeks. This is the 4th week. And so predictably, as we have done show after show, we start getting typical intellectual bombs lobbed at us. And so you are such a great apologist and such a great debater. I'd like to spend the last 20 minutes or so throwing some of those comments back at you, Steve, and how do you respond to them? So go ahead and scroll up. We'll throw a couple of these. These are actual questions from people in the audience or people who've logged onto the site to protest what we're doing. How about this one, Steve? If a mother knows that she won't be able to, and this is right up your family experience, if a mother knows she won't be able to provide for her child, isn't it actually more responsible, ethical, and moral to have an abortion, and in doing so prevent much needless suffering and misery for the mother, but for the child who's going to be born into poverty?
Define poverty. Define suffering. What do those terms mean? I'd ask you to define those for me. What do you think those mean? You know, what this question is the premise of what we know as utilitarian ethics. The idea that whatever causes the least amount of suffering is what's good. Of course, the problem with that is in the Judeo-Christian worldview, suffering actually has value. Christ is the suffering servant who suffered for us. Saints like Mother Teresa give away what the world values their entire lives to suffer for others in places of horrible oppression like Calcutta, right? And so who defines what is suffering? Let me tell you some of the people. You're in great company, whoever posted this. You're in great company with this argument. Let me give you some of the people that agree with what you just said. Marx, Pol Pot, Stalin, Ho Chi Minh. I mean, essentially, what's your next, if you're going to take your argument to its most logical conclusion, show me then your 5-year plan ending with gulags. See, this is what happens when we decide life's value is based on how it's valued for the living. For example, what if we decided, whoever posted that their life no longer had any value, that looking at them, sharing a planet with them caused too much suffering. And so since whoever his might makes right, we decided to end their life with their own worldview. Every time they cause suffering to another person, if you cause suffering to another person, and that means you forfeit the right to live, then I would imagine you should follow through all the way on your argument. I would assume at some point you've caused suffering to somebody else's life. Maybe you should end your own life then, if that's what you truly and really believe. These are really rationales to practice human sacrifice. It's an anthropological fact of human history, Duke. Every human civilization on Earth, every last one, has practiced a form of child or human sacrifice. We are doing it here too. It's just instead of Moloch or Chemosh or Anubis, it's the god of convenience. That's our fake God.
I love it. And again, Steve, your answer goes right back to teleology, doesn't it? What is the end purpose? You are pointing out an entire system, and you're laying your Chemosh and Moloch. You're talking about pagan societies primarily, right?
And that's what we have become.
Exactly.
We have become pagan society.
Exactly.
You know, the great irony here is we're not too many weeks removed from a bunch of progressives celebrating the life of a scientist who shook his fist at God his entire life. And could not live without professional medical equipment and help, could not breathe and eat and live on his own. Talking about Stephen Hawking. And yet, here's a guy who suffered immensely because of his medical maladies. And yet, a lot of progressives would say he made tremendous contributions to human society. Well, then, if this person really believes that suffering means your life isn't worthy of ending, why didn't they then go and urge pulling the plug on Stephen Hawking many, many years ago then, Duke? See, I'm not convinced the people who advocate this are really in favor of it, because they're never really willing to start with themselves or the people they hold in high esteem. It is life for me, but not for thee. These sorts of utilitarian arguments always underline that, bold it, circle it, or highlight it, always end in tyranny every time.
And, you know, the same people, not only that, these same people who would have deemed, if you gave them young preborn Stephen Hawking's future life physical career, that in 30 years, this young baby will suffer from this disease, that by 50 years old, we'll have him having to be artificially fed. Unilaterally, these same people who would have said, abort that baby, would have moved mountains, absolute mountains, and sacrificed probably a good many other lives to prolong the life of Stephen Hawking for another 20 years. That's the other end of it, isn't it? And so I think the teleological question, because paganism, as you just rightly pointed out, is when you only see life from within the prism of the material world. Worshipping pagan gods is worshipping gods that are trapped with inside nature as opposed to transcendent. This next question that we get all the time, I think you're going to hit this one out of the park too, because it too is primarily a teleological question. And it is this, Steve. Women have an absolute right to do what they wish with their own bodies.
No, they don't. Nobody does, actually. If Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, decided I have an absolute right to do whatever I want with my own body, who that is uttering that would say, you know, I think he's kind of right about that. He's got an absolute right. You do not have an absolute right to do whatever you want with your own body. You have a God-given right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and other inalienable rights with one condition. You cannot use your God-given rights to impose on the God-given rights of others, right? So let's look at this in the context of another issue, like religious freedom. So if someone were to say human sacrifice is inherent to my religion. So I get to kidnap women and I get to dismember them to my pagan god, because that's my First Amendment right to the freedom of religion. We would not defend him, and nor would not defending him make us hypocrites. But his religious view imposes on the God-given rights of somebody else, meaning he is saying, I can't practice my religion without ending your life. We don't permit you to practice your rights in a way that violate the rights of others. So a woman cannot walk into a department store, exercise the 5-finger discount, and say, I have an absolute right to do whatever I want with my body. Those products were made by somebody else's intellectual property, conscience, etc. That is what we call stealing. And we would say to such a woman, hey, you are charged with the crime of theft because you used your autonomy to impose on the autonomy and freedom of somebody else. But I think this question, while it is frankly stupid, does actually open up why we have not ended abortion. Because we have had largely the wrong argument in the pro-life movement. We aren't having the only argument that actually wins. The only argument that actually wins is, when is a life a life? When does life begin? Because Duke, you and I would agree that if a woman is not doing anything immoral with her own body, government should not be telling her what to do with it. You and I would agree with that, right, Duke? Would we not agree with that?
Absolutely.
So then, therefore, the only question is that her body or is it somebody else? Now, human beings, as far as I know, don't have 2 separate strands of DNA and 2 separate heartbeats going simultaneously. So that must mean if there's another strand of DNA, if there's another heartbeat there, guess what? That's another body. That's another person. You do not have the right to use your God-given rights and your personhood to impose on the personhood of somebody else. When you do, we call that a crime.
Well, and how much of Western morality, Steve, down through the centuries, the millennia has been based on the idea that your body isn't really yours. You didn't make it. You had personally no control over it. You can't necessarily determine its longevity or the moment that it dies. And so this goes back to the pre-teleological argument, right? That if indeed your body is something that was grounded in something outside of material reality, if there is a God, then you have even less of a right to do it. The person who recognizes that if we are created individuals, then we have certain obligations morally that contradict our bodies, right? Eating is good, being a glutton is not. And so those kind of things also, when you make it impossible for people like you two to understand these pre-material understandings, it's a lot easier, isn't it, to do what you said at the very beginning of this talk. We clinicize this. We argue that babies, this is one of the most horrible things I've had in 25 years as a professor. It happened to me just 3 weeks ago, Steve. I'm teaching this summer 3-week interim course, Maymester course at the university. And by quirk, I was able to teach the gospel. So 32 kids, 32 sophomores and juniors at a university sit down in my class 3 weeks ago, just ended yesterday. And I asked them, how many of you have ever read any of these books, the 4 Gospels? And only one student out of 32 had ever read any aspect of these Gospels. Staggering, right? So we started to read them, and we worked our way through them, and it was...
But trust me, Duke, they all know that they're full of contradictions, even though they've not read it.
That's what they thought. That's exactly what they thought. I had one biology major who the abortion came up, and she was very much like the U2 thing you just gave me. She was I was explaining Christ's law about loving the weak, and why should we do that? It's the same argument you could make about abortion, right? That liberals fall for all the time. Well, we should love the weak. We should sacrifice. Those of us who are strong and able-bodied, we should be willing to sacrifice tremendously for those who are weaker. And I said to her, well, does that also imply to your view on abortion? And I have never seen somebody turn and snarl, this 22-year-old. She goes, it's nothing but a parasite. It's nothing until it leaves my birth canal. I have full say over it. And by the end of the semester, 3 weeks later, when we had read the rest of the Gospels, she came up to me after class and she said, you know what? I want to apologize to you. She goes, I'm not sure what I believe anymore, but I am embarrassed for how glib I was, right? And it shows you that...
You pricked her conscience.
That's all it was, isn't it? Yeah. How about this one,
Yeah, because
Steve?
if you take her argument, Duke, why does it then have viability when it leaves your birth canal? I mean,
I hit her with that.
If it can't pay its own way, if it can't feed itself, if it needs to even be potty trained, why doesn't it have viability up until it's off your home and car insurance and medical insurance then? if that's the standard.
That's exactly right. And how about this one, Steve, that's related to that? Because I think we're bringing religion back into this a little bit. At least I have been trying to make an argument, and you have too, beyond just the material arguments. So how do you address this one? I thought you religious conservatives want the government to stay out of most personal. This is kind of a T-ball one, but go ahead. I thought you conservatives wanted government out of your personal decisions.
Well, it depends on if your personal decision impacts the person of somebody else. I mean, I don't know a single conservative that thinks the government ought to stay out of a decision when a man decides he's going to become a serial rapist. In fact, the conservative position is, should we execute him? Should we have the government execute him for his crimes or not? This gets down to two separate arguments. Number one, what is the role of government? In the Western view, which is really the Judeo-Christian view, that's really what Western's a nice way of saying Judeo-Christian to people that might get offended at using that term. But in the Western Judeo-Christian view, government exists to punish evildoers. It is, as Paul writes, the avenging angel, the sword of righteousness against evildoers. And so in that case, government is not intruding on someone's personal life when it arrests a serial murdering rapist and sends him to the gas chamber. They are fulfilling their divinely ordained role. And so this is, again, where we have to define what are the roles of government, and then ultimately, what do you have the right to do and what do you not have the right to do? And by the way, I'm old enough to remember when we were told what two consenting adults did in the privacy of their own bedroom wasn't going to harm anybody else's marriage, wasn't going to harm anybody else's businesses. If that were true, if this person's argument that they are putting forth, which is fake, but if they really believed it, then I assume they're lining up to stand with all the Christian bakers and florists and chaplains losing their jobs because they refuse to conform to what two consenting adults are doing in the privacy of their own bedroom, right, Duke? I'm sure they're there standing with Kelvin Cochran and Baron L. Stutzman and the Kleins in Oregon. I'm sure they're there saying, hey, what two people are doing and consenting to do in the privacy of their own bedroom shouldn't have an impact on your life and your marriage whatsoever. I'm sure they protested Kim Davis going to jail, because they want to be consistent with this position and all.
Well, if consistency were part of this debate, it had been over a long time ago. And we've got time for one more. And I think this takes us full circle, Steve. It gets back to where we started. It gets back to the argument that you made about even people who otherwise have a social conscience that's based in Christianity, like Bono. How about this one? Phrased the way a progressive would typically phrase these things. You fundies only care about babies until they're born. Then you oppose all the big government programs designed to help people. In the first place, it's a non sequitur, right? Whether we agree or don't agree with the government, what does that have to do with babies? And I think when they start throwing things like this out there, to me, it seems like they've already ceded the argument. They can't morally win the abortion argument. But how do you handle that one, right? The idea that you only care about people.
My character, one way or the other, doesn't determine what is a human life or not. It's what I said to my audience yesterday. If you guys find out in the weeks and months and years ahead as my profile gets raised that I have a secret kitty porn collection, it means I'm a hack. Means I'm a terrible person. But you know what it also means? It doesn't change one iota whether Jesus walked out of that tomb on the third day or not. It doesn't change. It doesn't change whether God made the world or not. It doesn't change whether one word of the Bible is true or not. My character, my ability to live up to my own standard, my own consistency with my own standard doesn't change whether there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him, one of them being hands which shed innocent blood. Because even if I am every bit the knuckle dragger your questioner assumes, here's the bad news with that. You're not going to stand naked and alone in front of me on your day of judgment. I'm not who you're going to answer to. I'm not the author of that life. I'm not the finisher of that life. I'm not the author of this word. I'm not the finisher of it. I am not the judge, jury, or divinely appointed the executioner. So your opinion of me and my character is completely irrelevant to this conversation. And that, again, is why I think we need to focus on the answer of when is a life a life? Because this is also it's a logical fallacy. then if you guys on the left claim to care so much about the disenfranchised and the disadvantaged, well, who's more disenfranchised and disadvantaged than a child in the womb, right? Each side can hoist the other from their own petard with their own hypocrisy. I would urge Christians and conservatives to stay away from moral relativistic arguments like this, because by having them, you lose. Stay on the side of objective, revealed, transcendent truth. Our character doesn't matter. Our character doesn't determine whether that child in the womb has his own DNA and has his own heartbeat or not. That has nothing to do with this. Stay on what is objectively provable, because here's the other reality, Duke. You and I are, and all of us watching that agree with what you and I are saying, we're sinners too. We cannot perfectly live up to what we are proclaiming to be the truth. And so if we allow this to become about our own consistency and values, our arguments will eventually collapse when we get caught saying and doing something that disappoints people. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Our character is not what this is about. It's about what is the truth. And if we don't live up to what we claim to be the truth, well, that speaks ill of our character, but it doesn't change what is actually true.
And to follow up on that, we Christian conservatives, we place our faith in the God who is beyond nature. And so consequently, if we're not humble as Christians, humble about our own sin, then we're doing it wrong. The secular progressive materialist left places their moral source of empowerment in politics, which is why the left can be so unhumble, right? Why Samantha Bee gets to keep her job, but Roseanne Barr can't. It's because their source of morality is actually contained in the political, not even nature, it's contained in the political realm. To be a Democrat, to be a progressive, to be a liberal means you never have to say you're sorry, right? That no matter how badly and how arrogantly you treat other people, especially the unborn, you're vindicated because of your politics.
Let me put this give it a real world example of this notion. Suppose, tragically, your child were kidnapped, and heroically, the police officer finds your child and rescues him from the person who kidnapped him to put him in a human trafficking ring. But at trial, by the time the trial has come around, the cop that rescued your child, we find out that he is actually wanted for skipping out on his own child support payments for his own kid. Would you want the judge to let the one who kidnapped your child and intended to do him harm and never return him to you, would you want that person let off of the crime they clearly committed because the character of this cop in another area comes into question? What do you think the person who asked you that question, their answer would be at that point, Duke?
You got it right. 100% correct. Nope, we don't care about his character. He saved my baby.
That's right. The truth doesn't change. The truth is he should pay his child support. He is clearly in moral violation in another area. And the truth is, this guy ought to go to prison for the rest of his life, this fiend for what he wanted to do to your kid. Yeah.
Steve Deace, it has been a tremendous pleasure to speak with you on this important topic. I want to thank you, as always, for taking the time to share your unique insights with us. And I'd like to remind everybody at home, you can get this kind of crystal clear, logical thinking every day at CRTV with Steve Deace. So please visit him and join up there at CRTV and watch this kind of quality programming. Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Good to be with you, Duke. Thank you, man. God bless.
Well, I want to take a moment by way of closing to thank you all for joining us for this 4-part series on the cultural and historical implications of abortion in America and throughout the world. We're grateful for Steve Deace for being our guest, and for you for being here. And a couple of things I want to leave you with. We try to take a different approach in this talk, this lecture series. One of the things I wanted to do is to start this talk by showing you that there are many valid reasons to be a person on the left and still be opposed to abortion. In fact, I think abortion is a human rights issue. Go all the way back to Alveda King. We shared with you in that opening lecture a number of progressive voices, a number of medical voices that warned us that what you're doing here is dehumanizing. You are trading comfort for life life, and it's not a good thing. So I wanted to show you first and foremost that this is not simply an issue for conservatives or Christians. It is an issue that applies to all of us, very much like slavery. It goes very much back to a lot of parallels between slavery. Just because slavery was legal one day, that never, ever for 1 minute made it moral. And during the slavery debate, there were people on both sides of the issue of the rights of individuals and the status of African Americans, on all sorts of political viewpoints that opposed slavery. Same thing here with abortion. It's a human rights issue is what it is. And if we're going to protect the most vulnerable, the weakest, those most in need of protection, as progressive social justice warriors insist they want to do, then how can we not protect that most vulnerable of classes, the unborn, the preborn? The other thing I wanted to point out to you, and I think we did a successful job of that, is just what bad law Roe versus Wade it is. And we showed you again how many progressive legal voices, how many left-wing legal voices point out that Roe versus Wade was horrible legislation. It was not based on the Constitution. It was not based on legal precedent. It was basically made up whole cloth by seven male justices, which the pro-abort left tells us men should never be deciding these issues. Well, 7 men basically made it up whole cloth without any rhyme or reason, and certainly without any scientific evidence to support their claims. And that is the final thing I want to leave you with, that the abortion question, as we become more and more scientifically savvy, certainly we've come a long way in understanding the development of a baby in the womb from 1973 to 2018. And everything else we're learning scientifically about babies shows you that they are babies. They are not dead clumps of tissue. They are not mutating cells. They are not like tumors. These are real flesh and blood individuals that are at a very, very early age are beginning to develop all sorts of capacities that must be protected, that have to be protected. The fact that they're not protected, except in the most radically extreme cases of the mother's health and life, is a travesty of justice. I want to thank you again for joining us, and look for more of these lecture series at freedomproject.com. We'll talk to you again soon.